Section 6 of The Trembling of a Leaf. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lilith Brander. The Trembling of a Leaf by W. Somerset Maugham. Section 6. Read. The skipper thrust his hand into one of his trousers pockets, and with difficulty, for they were not at the sides but in front, and he was a portly man, pulled out a large silver watch. He looked at it and then looked again at the declining sun. The Kanaka at the wheel gave him a glance, but did not speak. The skipper's eyes rested on the island they were approaching. A white line of foam marked the reef. He knew there was an opening large enough to get his ship through, and when they came a little nearer, he counted on seeing it. They had nearly an hour of daylight still before them. In the lagoon the water was deep, and they could anchor comfortably. The chief of the village, which he could already see among the coconut trees, was a friend of the mate's, and it would be pleasant to go ashore for the night. The mate came forward at the minute, and the skipper turned to him. "We'll take a bottle of booze along with us and get some girls in to dance," he said. "I don't see the opening," said the mate. He was a Kanaka, a handsome, swarthy fellow, with somewhat the look of a later Roman emperor, inclined to stoutness, but his face was fine and clean cut. "I'm dead sure there's one right here," said the captain, looking through his glasses. "I can't understand why I can't pick it up. Send one of the boys up the mast to have a look." The mate called one of the crew and gave him the order. The captain watched the Kanaka climb and waited for him to speak, but the Kanaka shouted on that he could see nothing but a broken line of foam. The captain spoke Samoan like a native, and he cursed him freely. "Shall we stay up there?" asked the mate. "What the hell good does that do?" answered the captain. "The blame fool can't see worth a cent, and you bet your sweet life I'd find the opening if I was up there." He looked at the slender mast with anger. It was all very well for a native who had been used to climbing up coconut trees all his life. He was fat and heavy. "Come down," he shouted. "You're no more use than a dead dog. We'll just have to go along the reef till we find the opening." It was a 60-ton schooner with paraffin auxiliary, and it ran, when there was no head wind, between 4 and 5 knots an hour. It was a bedraggled object. It had been painted white a very long time ago, but it was now dirty, dingy, and mottled. It smelled strongly of paraffin and of the copra, which was its usual cargo. They were within 100 feet of the reef now, and the captain told the steersman to run along it till they came to the opening. But when they had gone a couple of miles, he realized that they had missed it. He went about and slowly worked back again. The white foam of the reef continued without interruption, and now the sun was setting. With a curse at the stupidity of the crew, the skipper resigned himself to wait until next morning. "Put her about," he said. "I can't anchor here." They went out to sea a little, and presently it was quite dark. They anchored. When the sail was furled, the ship began to roll a good deal. They set in up here that one day she would roll right over, and the owner, a German-American who managed one of the largest stores, said that no money was big enough to induce him to go out in her. The cook, a Chinese in white trousers, very dirty and ragged, in a thin white tunic, came to say that supper was ready, and when the skipper went into the cabin, he found the engineer already seated at table. The engineer was a long, lean man with a scraggy neck. He was dressed in blue overalls and a sleeveless jersey, which showed his thin arms tattooed from elbow to wrist. "Hell, having to spend the night outside," said the skipper. The engineer did not answer, and they ate their supper in silence. The cabin was lit by a dim oil lamp. When they had eaten the canned apricots with which the meal finished, the Chink brought them a cup of tea. The skipper lit a cigar and went on the upper deck. The island now was only a darker mass against the night. The stars were very bright. The only sound was the ceaseless breaking of the surf. The skipper sank into a deck chair and smoked idly. Presently 3 or 4 members of the crew came up and sat down. One of them had a banjo and another a concertina. They began to play, and one of them sang. The native song sounded strange on these instruments. Then to the singing a couple began to dance. It was a barbaric dance, savage and primeval, rapid, with quick movements of the hands and feet and contortions of the body. It was sensual, sexual even, but sexual without passion. It was very animal, direct, weird, without mystery, natural in short, and one might almost say childlike. At last they grew tired. They stretched themselves on the deck and slept, and all was silent. The skipper lifted himself heavily out of his chair and clambered down the companion. He went into his cabin and got out of his clothes. He climbed into his bunk and lay there. He panted a little in the heat of the night. But next morning, when the dawn cracked over the tranquil sea, the opening in the reef which had eluded them the night before was seen a little to the east of where they lay. The schooner entered the lagoon. There was not a ripple on the surface of the water. Deep down among the coral rocks you saw little coloured fish swim. When he had anchored his ship, the skipper ate his breakfast and went on deck. The sun shone from an unclouded sky, but in the early morning the air was grateful and cool. It was Sunday, and there was a feeling of quietness, a silence as though nature were at rest, which gave him a peculiar sense of comfort. He sat, looking at the wooded coast, and felt lazy and well at ease. Presently a slow smile moved his lips, and he threw the stump of a cigar into the water. "I guess I'll go ashore," he said. "Get the boat out." He climbed stiffly down the ladder and was rowed to a little cove. The coconut trees came down to the water's edge, not in rows, but spaced out with an ordered formality. They were like a ballet of spinsters, elderly but flippant, standing in affected attitudes with the simpering graces of a bygone age. He sauntered idly through them, along a path that could be just seen winding its tortuous way, and it led him presently to a broad creek. There was a bridge across it, but a bridge constructed of single trunks of coconut trees, a dozen of them, placed end to end and supported where they met by a forked branch driven into the bed of the creek. You walked on a smooth round surface, narrow and slippery, and there was no support for the hand. To cross such a bridge required sure feet and a stout heart. The skipper hesitated, but he saw on the other side, nestling among the trees, a white man's house. He made up his mind and rather gingerly began to walk. He watched his feet carefully, and where one trunk joined on to the next and there was a difference of level, he tottered a little. It was with a gasp of relief that he reached the last tree and finally set his feet on the firm ground of the other side. He had been so intent on the difficult crossing that he never noticed anyone was watching him, and it was with surprise that he heard himself spoken to. "It takes a bit of nerve to cross this bridge as you're not used to them." He looked up and saw a man standing in front of him. He had evidently come out of the house which he had seen. "I saw you hesitate," the man continued, with a smile on his lips, "and I was watching to see you fall in." "Not on your life," said the captain, who had now recovered his confidence. "I've fallen in myself before now. I remember one evening I came back from shooting and I fell in, gun and all. Now I get a boy to carry my gun for me." He was a man no longer young, with a small beard, now somewhat grey, and a thin face. He was dressed in a singlet without arms and a pair of duck trousers. He wore neither shoes nor socks. He spoke English with a slight accent. "Are you Nilsen?" said the skipper. "I am." "I've heard about you. I thought you lived somewhere else round here." The skipper followed his host into the little bungalow and sat down heavily in the chair which the other motioned him to take. While Nilsen went out to fetch whisky and glasses, he took a look round the room. It filled him with amazement. He had never seen so many books. The shelves reached from floor to ceiling on all four walls, and they were closely packed. There was a grand piano littered with music, and a large table on which books and magazines lay in disorder. The room made him feel embarrassed. He remembered that Newson was a queer fellow. No one knew very much about him, although he had been in the islands for so many years. But those who knew him agreed that he was queer. He was a Swede. "You've got one big heap of books here," he said, when Newson returned. "They do no harm," answered Newson, with a smile. "Have you read them all?" asked the skipper. "Most of them. I'm a bit of a reader myself. I have the Saturday Evening Post sent me regular." Newson poured his visitor a good stiff glass of whisky and gave him a cigar. The skipper volunteered a little information. "I got in last night, but I couldn't find the opening, so I had to anchor outside. I'd never been this rum before, but my people had some stuff they wanted to bring over here. Gray, do you know him?" "Yes, he's got a store a little way along." "Well, there was a lot of canned stuff that he wanted over, and he's got some copra. They thought I might just as well come over as lie idle at Apia. I run between Apia and Pago Pago mostly, but they've got smallpox there just now, and there's nothing stirring." He took a drink of his whisky and lit a cigar. He was a taciturn man, but there was something in Newson that made him nervous, and his nervousness made him talk. The Swede was looking at him with large dark eyes, in which there was an expression of faint amusement. "There is a tidy little place you've got here. I've done my best with it." "You must do pretty well with your trees. They look fine, with copra at the price it is now. I had a bit of a plantation myself once, in Upolu it was, but I had to sell it." He looked round the room again, where all those books gave him a feeling of something incomprehensible and hostile. "I guess you must find it a bit lonesome here, though," he said. "I've got used to it. I've been here for 25 years. Now the captain could think of nothing more to say, and he smoked in silence. Newson had apparently no wish to break it. He looked at his guest with a meditative eye. He was a tall man, more than 6 feet high, and very stout. His face was red and blotchy, with a network of little purple veins on the cheeks, and his features were sunk into his fatness. His eyes were bloodshot, his neck was buried in rolls of fat. But for a fringe of long curly hair, nearly white, at the back of his head, he was quite bald, and that immense, shiny surface of forehead, which might have given him a false look of intelligence, on the contrary, gave him one of peculiar imbecility. He wore a blue flannel shirt, open at the neck, and showing his fat chest, covered with a mat of reddish hair, and a very old pair of blue serge trousers. He sat in his chair in a heavy, ungainly attitude, his great belly thrust forward, and his fat legs uncrossed. All elasticity had gone from his limbs. Newson wondered idly what sort of man he had been in his youth. It was almost impossible to imagine that this creature of vast bulk had ever been a boy who ran about. The skipper finished his whisky, and Newson pushed the bottle towards him. "Help yourself." The skipper leaned forward and with his great hand seized it. "And how come you in these parts anyways?" he said. "Oh, I came out to the islands for my health. My lungs were bad and they said I hadn't a year to live. You see, they were wrong. I meant, how come you to settle right here?" "I am a sentimentalist." "Oh." Newson knew that the skipper had not an idea what he meant, and he looked at him with an ironical twinkle in his dark eyes. Perhaps just because the skipper was so gross and dull a man, the whim seized him to talk further. "You were too busy keeping your balance to notice when you crossed the bridge, but this spot is generally considered rather pretty. It's a cute little house you've got here." "Ah, that wasn't here when I first came." There was a native hut, with its beehive roof and its pillars, overshadowed by a great tree with red flowers. and the croton bushes, their leaves yellow and red and golden, made a pied fence around it, and then all about were the coconut trees, as fanciful as women, and as vain. They stood at the water's edge and spent all day looking at their reflections. I was a young man then, good heavens, it's a quarter of a century ago, and I wanted to enjoy all the loveliness of the world in the short time allotted to me before I passed into the darkness. I thought it was the most beautiful spot I had ever seen. The first time I saw it, I had a catch at my heart, and I was afraid I was going to cry. I wasn't more than 25, and though I put the best face I could on it, I didn't want to die. And somehow it seemed to me that the very beauty of this place made it easier for me to accept my fate. I felt when I came here that all my past life had fallen away, Stockholm and its university, and then Bonn. It all seemed the life of somebody else, as though now at last I had achieved the reality which our doctors of philosophy, I am one myself, you know, had discussed so much. A year, I cried to myself. I have a year. I will spend it here, and then I am content to die. We are foolish and sentimental and melodramatic at 25, but if we weren't, perhaps we should be less wise at 50. Now drink, my friend. Don't let the nonsense I talk interfere with you. He waved his thin hand towards the bottle, and the skipper finished what remained in his glass. You ain't drinking nothing? He said, reaching for the whisky. I'm of a sober habit, smiled the Swede. I intoxicate myself in ways which I fancy are more subtle. But perhaps that is only vanity. Anyhow, the effects are more lasting and the results less deleterious. They say there's a deal of cocaine taken in the States now, said the captain. Newson chuckled. But I do not see a white man often, he continued. And for once I don't think a drop of whisky can do me any harm. He poured himself out a little, added some soda, and took a sip. And presently I found out why the spot has such an unearthly loveliness. Here love had tarried for a moment like a migrant bird that happens on a ship in mid-ocean and for a little while folds its tired wings. The fragrance of a beautiful passion hovered over it like the fragrance of hawthorn in May in the meadows of my home. It seems to me that the places where men have loved or suffered keep about them always some faint aroma of something that has not wholly died. It is as though they had acquired a spiritual significance which mysteriously affects those who pass. I wish I could make myself clear. He smiled a little, though I cannot imagine that if I did you would understand. He paused. I think this place was beautiful because here I had been loved beautifully. And now he shrugged his shoulders. But perhaps it is only that my aesthetic sense is gratified by the happy conjunction of young love and a suitable setting. Even a man less thick-witted than the skipper might have been forgiven if he were bewildered by Newson's words, for he seemed faintly to laugh at what he said. It was as though he spoke from emotion, which his intellect found ridiculous. He had said himself that he was a sentimentalist, and when sentimentality is joined with scepticism, there is often the devil to pay. He was silent for an instant and looked at the captain with eyes in which there was a sudden perplexity. You know, I can't help thinking that I've seen you before somewhere or other, he said. I couldn't say as I remember you, returned the skipper. I have a curious feeling as though your face were familiar to me. It's been puzzling me for some time, but I can't situate my recollection in any place or at any time. The skipper massively shrugged his heavy shoulders. It's 30 years since I first come to the islands. A man can't figure on remembering all the folk he meets in a while like that. The Swede shook his head. You know how one sometimes has the feeling that a place one has never been to before is strangely familiar. That's how I seem to see you. He gave a whimsical smile. Perhaps I knew you in some past existence. Perhaps you were the master of a galley in ancient Rome and I was a slave at the oar. 30 years have you been here? Every bit of 30 years. I wonder if you knew a man called Red? Red. That is the only name I've ever known him by. I never knew him personally. I never even set eyes on him, and yet I seem to see him more clearly than many men. My brothers, for instance, with whom I passed my daily life for many years. He lives in my imagination with the distinctness of a Paulo Malatesta or a Romeo. But I dare say you have never read Dante or Shakespeare." "I can't say as I have," said the captain. Nilsson, smoking a cigar, leaned back in his chair and looked vacantly at the ring of smoke which floated in the still air. A smile played on his lips, but his eyes were grave. Then he looked at the captain. There was in his gross obesity something extraordinarily repellent. He had the plethoric self-satisfaction of the very fat. It was an outrage. It set Nilsson's nerves on edge. But the contrast between the man before him and the man he had in mind was pleasant. It appears that Red was the most comely thing you ever saw. I've talked to quite a number of people who knew him in those days, white men, and they all agree that the first time you saw him his beauty just took your breath away. They called him Red on account of his flaming hair. He had a natural wave and he wore it long. He must have been of that wonderful colour that the pre-Raphaelites raved over. I don't think he was vain of it. He was much too ingenious for that. But no one could have blamed him if he had been. He was tall, 6 feet and an inch or two. In the native house that used to stand here was the mark of his height cut with a knife on the central trunk that supported the roof, and he was made like a Greek god, broad in the shoulders and thin in the flanks. He was like Apollo, with just that soft roundness which Praxiteles gave him, and that suave, feminine grace which has in it something troubling and mysterious. His skin was dazzling white, milky, like satin. His skin was like a woman's. "I had kind of a white skin myself when I was a kiddie," said the skipper, with a twinkle in his bloodshot eyes. But Nilsson paid no attention to him. He was telling his story now, and interruption made him impatient. And his face was just as beautiful as his body. He had large blue eyes, very dark, so that some say they were black. And unlike most red-haired people, he had dark eyebrows and long dark lashes. His features were perfectly regular, and his mouth was like a scarlet wound. He was 20. On these words the Swede stopped with a sudden sense of the dramatic. He took a sip of whisky. He was unique. There never was anyone more beautiful. There was no more reason for him than for a wonderful blossom to flower on a wild plant. He was a happy accident of nature. One day he landed at that cove into which you must have put this morning. He was an American sailor, and he had deserted from a man of war in Apia. He had induced some good-humoured native to give him a passage on a cutter that happened to be sailing from Apia to Safoto, and he had been put ashore here in a dugout. I do not know why he deserted. Perhaps life on a man of war with its restrictions irked him. Perhaps he was in trouble. And perhaps it was the South Seas and these romantic islands that got into his bones. Every now and then they take a man strangely, and he finds himself like a fly in a spider's web. It may be that there was a softness of fibre in him. And these green hills, with their soft airs, this blue sea, took the northern strength from him as Delilah took the Nazarites. Anyhow, he wanted to hide himself, and he thought he would be safe in this secluded nook till his ship had sailed from Samoa. There was a native hut at the cove, and as he stood there, wondering where exactly he should turn his steps, a young girl came out and invited him to enter. He knew scarcely 2 words of the native tongue, and she as little English. But he understood well enough what her smiles meant and her pretty gestures, and he followed her. He sat down on a mat and she gave him slices of pineapple to eat. I can speak of Red only from hearsay, but I saw the girl 3 years after he first met her, and she was scarcely 19 then. You cannot imagine how exquisite she was. She had the passionate grace of the hibiscus and the rich colour. She was rather tall, slim, with the delicate features of her race, and large eyes like pools of still water under the palm trees. Her hair, black and curling, fell down her back, and she wore a wreath of scented flowers. Her hands were lovely. They were so small, so exquisitely formed. They gave your heartstrings a wrench. And in those days she laughed easily. Her smile was so delightful that it made your knees shake. Her skin was like a field of ripe corn on a summer day. Good heavens, how can I describe her? She was too beautiful to be real. And these two young things, she was 16 and he was 20, fell in love with one another at first sight. That is the real love, not the love that comes from sympathy, common interests, or intellectual community, but love pure and simple. That is the love that Adam felt for Eve when he awoke and found her in the garden, gazing at him with dewy eyes. That is the love that draws the beasts to one another, and the gods. That is the love that makes the world a miracle. That is the love which gives life its pregnant meaning. You have never heard of the wise, cynical French duke who said that with two lovers there is always one who loves and one who lets himself be loved. It is a bitter truth to which most of us have to resign ourselves, but now and then there are two who love and two who let themselves be loved. Then one might fancy that the sun stands still as it stood when Joshua prayed to the God of Israel. And even now, after all these years, when I think of these two, so young, so fair, so simple, and of their love, I feel a pang. It tears my heart just as my heart is torn when on certain nights I watch the full moon shining on the lagoon from an unclouded sky. There is always pain in the contemplation of perfect beauty. They were children. She was good and sweet and kind. I know nothing of him, and I like to think that then, at all events, he was ingenious and frank. I like to think that his soul was as comely as his body, but I dare say he had no more soul than the creatures of the woods and forests who made pipes from reeds and bathed in the mountain streams when the world was young, and you might catch sight of little fawns galloping through the glade on the back of a bearded centaur. A soul is a troublesome possession, and when man developed it he lost the Garden of Eden. Well, when Red came to the island it had recently been visited by one of those epidemics which the white man had brought to the South Seas, and 1/3 of the inhabitants had died. It seems that the girl had lost all her near kin, and she lived now in the house of distant cousins. The household consisted of 2 ancient crones, bowed and wrinkled, 2 young women, and a man and a boy. For a few days he stayed there, but perhaps he felt himself too near the shore, with the possibility that he might fall in with white men who would reveal his hiding place. Perhaps the lovers could not bear that the company of others should rob them for an instant of the delight of being together. One morning they set out, the pair of them, with a few things that belonged to the girl, and walked along a grassy path under the coconuts, till they came to the creek you see. They had to cross the bridge you crossed, and the girl laughed gleefully because he was afraid. She held his hand till they came to the end of the first tree, and then his carriage failed him and had to go back. He was obliged to take off all his clothes before he could risk it, and she carried them over for him on her head. They settled down in the empty hut that stood here. Whether she had any rights over it, land tenure is a complicated business in the islands, or whether the owner had died during the epidemic, I do not know, but anyhow no one questions them. They took possession. The furniture consisted of a couple of grass mats on which they slept, a fragment of looking-glass, and a bowl or two. In this pleasant land that is enough to start housekeeping on. They say that happy people have no history, and certainly a happy love has none. They did nothing all day long, and yet the day seemed all too short. The girl had a native name, but Red called her Sally. He picked up the easy language very quickly, and he used to lie on the mat for hours while she chattered gaily to him. He was a silent fellow, and perhaps his mind was lethargic. He smoked incessantly the cigarettes which she made him out of the native tobacco and pandanus leaf, and he watched her while with deft fingers she made grass mats. Often natives would come in and tell long stories of the old days when the island was disturbed by tribal wars. Sometimes he would go fishing on the reef and bring home a basket full of coloured fish. Sometimes at night he would go out with a lantern to catch lobster. There were plantains round the hut and Sally would roast them for their frugal meal. She knew how to make delicious messes from coconuts, and the breadfruit tree by the side of the creek gave them its fruit. On feast days they killed a little pig and cooked it on hot stones. They bathed together in the creek, and in the evening they went down to the lagoon and paddled about in the dugout with its great outrigger. The sea was deep blue, wine-coloured at sundown, like the sea of Homeric Greece. But in the lagoon the colour had an infinite variety, aquamarine and amethyst and emerald, and the setting sun turned it for a short moment to liquid gold. Then there was the colour of the coral, brown, white, pink, red, purple, and the shapes it took were marvellous. It was like a magic garden, and the hurrying fish were like butterflies. It strangely lacked reality. Among the coral were pools with a floor of white sand, and here, where the water was dazzling clear, it was very good to bathe. Then, cool and happy, they wandered back in the gloaming over the soft grass road to the creek, walking hand in hand. And now the minor birds filled the coconut trees with their clamour. And then the night, with that great sky shining with gold that seemed to stretch more widely than the skies of Europe, and the soft airs that blew gently through the open hut, the long night again was all too short. She was 16 and he was barely 20. The dawn crept in among the wooden pillars of the hut and looked at those lovely children sleeping in one another's arms. The sun hid behind the great tattered leaves of the plantains so that it might not disturb them, and then with playful malice shot a golden ray, like the outstretched paw of a Persian cat, on their faces. They opened their sleepy eyes, and they smiled to welcome another day. The weeks lengthened into months, and a year passed. They seemed to love one another as, I hesitate to say passionately. Passion has in it always a shade of sadness, a touch of bitterness or anguish, but as wholeheartedly, as simply and naturally as on the first day on which, meeting, they had recognized that the god was in them. If you had asked them, I have no doubt that they would have thought it impossible to suppose their love could ever cease. Do we not know that the essential element of love is a belief in its own eternity? And yet perhaps in Red there was already a very little seed, unknown to himself and unsuspected by the girl, which would in time have grown to weariness. For one day, one of the natives from the cove told them that somewhere down the coast, at the anchorage, was a British whaling ship. "Gee," he said, "I wonder if I could make a trade of some nuts and plantains for a pound or two of tobacco." The pandanus cigarettes that Sally made him with untiring hands were strong and pleasant enough to smoke, but they left him unsatisfied, and he yearned on a sudden for real tobacco, hard, rank and pungent. He had not smoked a pipe for many months. His mouth watered at the thought of it. One would have thought some premonition of harm would have made Sally seek to dissuade him, but love possessed her so completely that it never occurred to her any power on earth could take him from her. They went up into the hills together and gathered a great basket of wild oranges, green, but sweet and juicy, and they picked plantains from around the hut, and coconuts from their trees, and breadfruit and mangoes, and they carried them down to the cove. They loaded the unstable canoe with them, and Red and the native boy who had brought them the news of the ship paddled along outside the reef. It was the last time she ever saw him. Next day the boy came back alone. He was all in tears. This is the story he told. When after their long paddle they reached the ship and Red hailed it, a white man looked over the side and told them to come on board. They took the fruit they had brought with him, and Red piled it up on the deck. The white man and he began to talk, and they seemed to come to some agreement. One of them went below and brought up tobacco. Red took some at once and lit a pipe. The boy imitated the zest with which he blew a great cloud of smoke from his mouth. Then they said something to him. He went into the cabin. Through the open door the boy, watching curiously, saw a bottle brought out and glasses. Red drank and smoked. They seemed to ask him something, but he shook his head and laughed. The first man who had spoken to them, laughed too, and he filled Red's glass once more. They went on talking and drinking, and presently, growing tired of watching a sight that meant nothing to him, the boy curled himself up on the deck and slept. He was awakened by a kick, and jumping to his feet, he saw that the ship was slowly sailing out of the lagoon. He caught sight of Red seated at the table, with his head resting heavily on his arms, fast asleep. He made a movement towards him, intending to wake him, but a rough hand seized his arm, and the man, with a scowl and words which he did not understand, pointed to the side. He shouted to Red, but in a moment he was seized and flung overboard. Helpless, he swam round to his canoe, which was drifting a little way off, and pushed it on to the reef. He climbed in, and sobbing all the way, paddled back to shore. What had happened was obvious enough. The whaler, by desertion or sickness, was short of hands, and the captain, when Red came aboard, had asked him to sign on. On his refusal, he had made him drunk and kidnapped him. Sally was beside herself with grief. For 3 days she screamed and cried. The natives did what they could to comfort her, but she would not be comforted. She would not eat, and then, exhausted, she sank into a sullen apathy. She spent long days at the cove, watching the lagoon, in the vain hope that Red somehow or other would manage to escape. She sat on the white sand hour after hour, with the tears running down her cheeks, and at night dragged herself wearily back across the creek to the little hut where she had been happy. The people with whom she had lived before Red came to the island wished her to return to them, but she would not. She was convinced that Red would come back, and she wanted him to find her where he had left her. 4 months later she was delivered of a stillborn child, and the old woman who had come to help her through her confinement remained with her in the hut. All joy was taken from her life. If her anguish with time became less intolerable, it was replaced by a settled melancholy. You would not have thought that among these people, whose emotions, though so violent, are very transient, a woman could be found capable of so enduring a passion. She never lost a profound conviction that sooner or later Red would come back. She watched for him, and every time someone crossed this slender little bridge of coconut trees she looked. It might at last be he. Nilsen stopped talking and gave a faint sigh. "And what happened to her in the end?" asked the skipper. Nilsen smiled bitterly. "Oh, 3 years afterwards she took up with another white man." The skipper gave a fat, cynical chuckle. "That's generally what happens to them," he said. The Swede shot him a look of hatred. He did not know why that gross, obese man excited in him so violent a repulsion. But his thoughts wandered, and he found his mind filled with memories of the past. He went back 25 years. It was when he first came to the island, weary of Apia, with its heavy drinking, its gambling and coarse sensuality, a sick man, trying to resign himself to the laws of the career which had fired his imagination with ambitious thoughts. He set beside him resolutely all his hopes of making a great name for himself, and strove to content himself with a few poor months of careful life. which was all that he could count on. He was supporting with a half-caste trader who had a store of a couple of miles along the coast at the edge of a native village, and one day, wandering aimlessly along the grassy paths of the coconut groves, he had come upon the hut in which Sally lived. The beauty of the spot had filled him with a rapture so great that it was almost painful. And then he had seen Sally. She was the loveliest creature he had ever seen, and the sadness in those dark, magnificent eyes of hers affected him strangely. The Kanakas were a handsome race, and beauty was not rare among them, but it was the beauty of shapely animals. It was empty, but those tragic eyes were dark with mystery, and you felt in them the bitter complexity of the groping human soul. The trader told him the story and it moved him. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" asked Newson. "No fear."
"Why?"
"It'll be a couple of years before the ship is paid off, and by then he'll have forgotten all about her. I bet he was pretty mad when he woke up and found he'd been shanghaied, and I shouldn't wonder if he wanted to fight somebody. But he'd got green and buried, and I guess in a month he was thinking it the best thing that had ever happened to him that he got away from the island." But Newson could not get the story out of his head. Perhaps because he was sick and weakly, the radiant health of Red appealed to his imagination. Himself an ugly man, insignificant of appearance, he prized very highly comeliness in others. He had never been passionately in love, and certainly had never been passionately loved. The mutual attraction of those two young things gave him a singular delight. It had the ineffable beauty of the absolute. He went again to the little hut by the creek. He had a gift for languages and an energetic mind, accustomed to work, and he had already given much time to the study of the local tongue. Old habit was strong in him, and he was gathering together material for a paper on the Samoan speech. The old crone who shared the hut with Sally invited him to come in and sit down. She gave him kava to drink and cigarettes to smoke. She was glad to have someone to chat with, and while she talked, he looked at Sally. She reminded him of the Psyche in the museum at Naples. Her features had the same dear purity of line, and though she had borne a child, she had still a virginal aspect. It was not till he had seen her 2 or 3 times that he induced her to speak. Then it was only to ask him if he had seen in Apia a man called Red. 2 years had passed since his disappearance, but it was plain that she still thought of him incessantly. It did not take Newson long to discover that he was in love with her. It was only by an effort of will now that he prevented himself from going every day to the creek. And when he was not with Sally, his thoughts were, at first, looking upon himself as a dying man. He asked only to look at her and occasionally hear her speak, and his love gave him a wonderful happiness. He exulted in his purity. He wanted nothing from her but the opportunity to weave around her graceful person a web of beautiful fancies. But the open air, the equable temperature, the rest, the simple fare, began to have an unexpected effect on his health. His temperature did not soar at night to such alarming heights. He coughed less and began to put on weight. 6 months passed without his having a hemorrhage, and on a sudden he saw the possibility that he might live. He had studied his disease carefully, and the hope dawned upon him that with great care he might arrest its course. It exhilarated him to look forward once more to the future. He made plans. It was evident that any active life was out of the question, but he could live on the islands, and the small income he had, and sufficient elsewhere, would be ample to keep him. He could grow coconuts. That would give him an occupation, and he would send for his books and a piano. But his quick mind saw that in all this he was merely trying to conceal from himself the desire that obsessed him. He wanted Sally. He loved not only her beauty, but that dim soul which he divined behind her suffering eyes. He would intoxicate her with his passion. In the end he would make her forget, and in an ecstasy of surrender he fancied himself giving her too the happiness which he had thought never to know again, but had now so miraculously achieved. He asked her to live with him. She refused. He had expected that and did not let it depress him, for he was sure that sooner or later she would yield. His love was irresistible. He told the old woman of his wishes, and found somewhat to his surprise that she and the neighbours, long aware of them, were strongly urging Sally to accept his offer. After all, every native was glad to keep house for a white man. Newson, according to the standards of the island, was a rich one. The trader with whom he boarded went to her and told her not to be a fool. Such an opportunity would not come again. And after so long she could not still believe that Red would ever return. The girl's resistance only increased Newson's desire, and what had been a very pure love now became an agonizing passion. He was determined that nothing should stand in his way. He gave Sally no peace. At last, worn out by his persistence and the persuasions, by turns pleading and angry, of everyone around her, she consented. But the day after when, exultant, he went to see her, he found that in the night she had burnt down the hut in which she and Red had lived together. The old crone ran towards him full of angry abuse of Sally, but he waved her aside. It did not matter. They would build a bungalow on the place where the hut had stood. A European house would really be more convenient if he wanted to bring out a piano and a vast number of books. And so the little wooden house was built in which he had now lived for many years, and Sally became his wife. But after the first few weeks of rapture, during which he was satisfied with what she gave him, he had known little happiness. She had yielded to him through weariness, but she had only yielded what she set no store on. The soul which he had dimly glimpsed escaped him. He knew that she cared nothing for him. She still loved Red, and all the time she was waiting for his return. And a sigh from him, Newson knew that, notwithstanding his love, his tenderness, his sympathy, his generosity, she would leave him without a moment's hesitation. She would never give a thought to his distress. Anguish seized him, and he battered at that impenetrable self of hers which sullenly resisted him. His love became bitter. He tried to melt her heart with kindness, but it remained as hard as before. He feigned indifference, but she did not notice it. Sometimes he lost his temper and abused her, and then she wept silently. Sometimes he thought she was nothing but a fraud, and that so simply an invention of his own. And then he could not get into the sanctuary of her heart because there was no sanctuary there. His love became a prison from which he longed to escape, but he had not the strength merely to open the door. That was all it needed, and walk out into the open air. It was torture, and at last he became numb and hopeless. In the end, the fire burned itself out, and when he saw her eyes rest for an instant on the slender bridge, it was no longer rage that filled his heart, but impatience. For many years now, they had lived together, bound by the ties of habit and convenience, and it was with a smile that he looked back on his old passion. She was an old woman, for the women on the islands age quickly, and if he had no love for her any more, he had tolerance. She left him alone. He was contented with his piano and his books. His thoughts led him to a desire for words. When I look back now and reflect on that brief passionate love of Red and Sally, I think that perhaps they should thank the ruthless fate that separated them when their love seemed still to be at its height. They suffered, but they suffered in beauty. They were spared the real tragedy of love. "I don't know exactly as I get you," said the skipper. "The tragedy of love is not death or separation. How long do you think it would have been before one or other of them ceased to care? Oh, it is dreadfully bitter to look at a woman whom you have loved with all your heart and soul, so that you felt you could not bear to let her out of your sight, and realize that you would not mind if you never saw her again. The tragedy of love is indifference. But while he was speaking, a very extraordinary thing happened. Though he had been addressing the skipper, he had not been talking to him. He had been putting his thoughts into words for himself, and with his eyes fixed on the man in front of him, he had not seen him. But now an image presented itself to them, an image not of the man he saw, but of another man. It was as though he were looking into one of those distorting mirrors that make you extraordinarily squat or outrageously elongate, but here exactly the opposite took place. And in the obese, ugly old man he caught the shadowy glimpse of a stripling. He gave him now a quick, searching scrutiny. Why had a haphazard stroll brought him just to this place? A sudden tremor of his heart made him slightly breathless. An absurd suspicion seized him. What had occurred to him was impossible, and yet it might be a fact. "What is your name?" he asked abruptly. The skipper's face puckered and he gave a cunning chuckle. He looked then malicious and horribly vulgar. "It's such a damned long time since I've had it that I almost forget it myself. But for 30 years now in the islands they've always called me Red." His huge form shook as he gave a low, almost silent laugh. It was obscene. Newson shuddered. Red was hugely amused, and from his bloodshot eyes tears ran down his cheeks. Newson gave a gasp, for at that moment a woman came in. She was a native, a woman of somewhat commanding presence, stout without being corpulent, dark, for the natives grow darker with age, with very grey hair. She wore a black Mother Hubbard, and its thinness showed her heavy breasts. The moment had come. She made an observation to Newson about some household matter, and he answered. He wondered if his voice sounded as unnatural to her as it did to himself. She gave the man who was sitting in the chair by the window an indifferent glance, and went out of the room. The moment had come and gone. Newson for a moment could not speak. He was strangely shaken. Then he said, "I'd be very glad if you'd stay and have a bit of dinner with me, pot luck." "I don't think I will," said Red. "I must go after this fellow Grey. I'll give him his stuff and then I'll get away. I want to be back in Apia tomorrow. I'll send a boy along with you to show you the way." "That'll be fine." Red heaved himself out of his chair, while the Swede called one of the boys who worked on the plantation. He told him where the skipper wanted to go, and the boy stepped along the bridge. Red prepared to follow him. "Don't fall in," said Newson. "Not on your life." Newson watched him make his way across, and when he had disappeared among the coconuts he stood still. Then he sank heavily in his chair. Was that the man who had prevented him from being happy? Was that the man whom Sally had loved all these years and for whom she had waited so desperately? It was grotesque. A sudden fury seized him so that he had an instinct to spring up and smash everything around him. He had been cheated. They had seen each other at last and had not known it. He began to laugh mirthlessly, and his laughter grew till it became hysterical. The gods had played him a cruel trick, and he was old now. At last Sally came in to tell him dinner was ready. He sat down in front of her and tried to eat. He wondered what she would say if he told her now that the fat old man sitting in the chair was the lover whom she remembered still with the passionate abandonment of her youth. Years ago, when he hated her because she made him so unhappy, he would have been glad to tell her. He wanted to hurt her then as she hurt him, because his hatred was only love. But now he did not care. He shrugged his shoulders listlessly. "What did that man want?" she asked presently. He did not answer at once. She was old too, a fat old native woman. He wondered why he had ever loved her so madly. He had laid at her feet all the treasures of his soul, and she had cared nothing for them. Waste. What waste? And now, when he looked at her, he felt only contempt. His patience was at last exhausted. He answered her question. "He's the captain of a schooner. He's come from Apia." "Yes. He brought me news from home. My eldest brother is very ill. I must go back." "Will you be gone long?" He shrugged his shoulders. End of section 6. Section 7 of The Trembling of a Leaf. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lilith Brenda. The Trembling of a Leaf by W. Somerset Maugham. Section 7. The Pool. Part 1. When I was introduced to Lawson by a chaplain, the owner of the Hotel Metropole at Apia, I paid no particular attention to him. We were sitting in the lounge over an early cocktail, and I was listening with amusement to the gossip of the island. Chaplain entertained me. He was by profession a mining engineer, and perhaps it was characteristic of him that he had settled in a place where his professional attainments were of no possible value. It was, however, generally reported that he was an extremely clever mining engineer. He was a small man, neither fat nor thin, with black hair, scanty on the crown, turning grey, and a small untidy moustache. His face, partly from the sun and partly from liquor, was very red. He was but a figurehead for the hotel, though so grandly named, but a frame building of 2 stories was managed by his wife, a tall, gaunt Australian of 45, with an imposing presence and a determined air. The little man, excitable and often tipsy, was terrified of her, and the stranger soon heard of domestic quarrels, in which she used her fist and her foot in order to keep him in subjection. She had been known after a night of drunkenness to confine him for 24 hours to his own room, and then he could be seen, afraid to leave his prison, talking somewhat pathetically from his veranda to people on the street below. He was a character, and his reminiscences of a varied life, whether true or not, made him worth listening to. So that when Lawson strolled in, I was inclined to resent the interruption. Although not midday, it was clear that he had had enough to drink, and it was without enthusiasm that I yielded to his persistence and accepted his offer of another cocktail. I knew already that Chaplin's head was weak. The next round, which in common politeness I should be forced to order, would be enough to make him lively, and then Mrs. Chaplin would give me black looks. Nor was there anything attractive in Lawson's appearance. He was a little thin man, with a long, sallow face and a narrow, weak chin, a prominent nose, large and bony, and great shaggy black eyebrows. They gave him a peculiar look. His eyes, very large and very dark, were magnificent. He was jolly, but his jollity did not seem to me sincere. It was on the surface a mask which he wore to deceive the world, and I suspected that it concealed a mean nature. He was plainly anxious to be thought a good sport, and he was hail fellow well met. But I do not know why, I felt that he was cunning and shifty. He talked a great deal in a raucous voice, and he and Chaplin kept one another's stories of beanos which had become legendary, stories of wet nights at the English Club, of shooting expeditions where an incredible amount of whisky had been consumed, and of jaunts to Sydney, of which their pride was that they could remember nothing from the time they landed till the time they sailed. A pair of drunken swine. But even in their intoxication, for by now, after 4 cocktails each, neither was sober, there was a great difference between Chaplin, rough and vulgar, and Lawson. Lawson might be drunk, but he was certainly a gentleman. At last he got out of his chair, a little unsteadily. "Well, I'll be getting along home," he said. "See you before dinner." "Missus all right?" said Chaplin. "Yes." He went out. There was a peculiar note in the monosyllable of his answer, which made me look up. "Good chap," said Chaplin flatly, as Lawson went out of the door into the sunshine. One of the best. Pity he drinks." This from Chaplin was an observation not without humour. "And when he's drunk he wants to fight people." "Is he often drunk?" "Dead drunk. 3 or 4 days a week." "It's the island done it." "And Ethel." "Who's Ethel?" "Ethel's his wife. Married a half-caste. Old Brefeld's daughter. Took her away from here. Only thing to do. But she couldn't stand it. And now they're back again. He'll hang himself one of these days. If he don't drink himself to death before. Good chap. Nasty when he's drunk." Chaplin belched loudly. "I'll go and put my head under the shower. I oughtn't to have had that last cocktail. It's always the last one that does you in." He looked uncertainly at the staircase as he made up his mind to go to the cubby hole in which was the shower, and then with a natural seriousness got up. "Pay you to cultivate Lawson," he said. "A well-read chap. You'd be surprised when he's sober. Clever too. Worth talking to." Chaplin had told me the whole story in these few speeches. When I came in towards evening from a ride along the seashore, Lawson was again in the hotel. He was heavily sunk in one of the cane chairs in the lounge, and he looked at me with glassy eyes. It was plain that he had been drinking all the afternoon. He was torpid, and the look on his face was sullen and vindictive. His glance rested on me for a moment, but I could see that he did not recognize me. 2 or 3 other men were sitting there, shaking dice, and they took no notice of him. His condition was evidently too usual to attract attention. I sat down and began to play. "You're a damned sociable lot," said Lawson suddenly. He got out of his chair and waddled with bent knees towards the door. I do not know whether the spectacle was more ridiculous than revolting. When he had gone, one of the men sniggered. "Lawson's fairly soused today," he said. "If I couldn't carry my liquor better than that," said another, "I'd climb on the wagon and stay there." Who would have thought that this wretched object was in his way a romantic figure, or that his life had in it those elements of pity and terror which the theorist tells us are necessary to achieve the effects of tragedy? I did not see him again for 2 or 3 days. I was sitting one evening on the first floor of the hotel on a veranda that overlooked the street when Lawson came up and sank into a chair beside me. He was quite sober. He made a casual remark and then, when I had replied somewhat indifferently, added with a laugh which had in it an apologetic tone: "I was devilly soused the other day." I did not answer. There was really nothing to say. I pulled away at my pipe in the vain hope of keeping the mosquitoes away, and looked at the natives going home from their work. They walked with long steps, slowly, with care and dignity, and the soft patter of their naked feet was strange to hear. Their dark hair, curling or streaked, was often white with lime, and then they had a look of extraordinary distinction. They were tall and finely built. Then a gang of Solomon Islanders, indentured labourers, passed by, singing. They were shorter and slighter than the Samoans, coal-black, with great heads of fuzzy hair dyed red. Now and then a white man drove past in his buggy or rode into the hotel yard. In the lagoon 2 or 3 schooners reflected their greys in the tranquil water. "I don't know what there is to do in a place like this except to get soused," said Lawson at last. "Don't you like Samoa?" I asked casually, for something to say. "It's pretty, isn't it?" The word he chose seemed so inadequate to describe the unimaginable beauty of the island that I smiled, and smiling I turned to look at him. I was startled by the expression in those fine sober eyes of his, an expression of intolerable anguish. They betrayed a tragic depth of emotion of which I should never have thought him capable. But the expression passed away, and he smiled. His smile was simple and a little naive. It changed his face so that I wavered in my first feeling of aversion from him. "I was all over the place when I first came out," he said. He was silent for a moment. "I went away for good about 3 years ago, but I came back." He hesitated. "My wife wanted to come back. She was born here, you know." "Oh, yes." He was silent again, and then hazarded a remark about Robert Louis Stevenson. He asked me if I had been up to Vailima. For some reason he was making an effort to be agreeable to me. He began to talk of Stevenson's books, and presently the conversation drifted to London. "I suppose Covent Garden's still going strong," he said. "I think I miss the opera as much as anything here. Have you seen Tristan and Isolde?" He asked me the question as though the answer were really important to him, and when I said, a little casually I daresay, that I had, he seemed pleased. He began to speak of Wagner, not as a musician, but as the playing man who received from him an emotional satisfaction that he could not analyse. "I suppose Bayreuth was the place to go really," he said. "I never had the money, worse luck. But of course one might do worse than Covent Garden. All the lights and the women dressed up to the nines and the music. The first act of the Walküre's all right, isn't it? And the end of Tristan, golly." His eyes were flashing now, and his face was lit up so that he hardly seemed the same man. There was a flush on his sallow, thin cheeks, and I forgot that his voice was harsh and unpleasant. There was even a certain charm about him. "By George, I'd like to be in London tonight. Do you know the Pall Mall restaurant? I used to go there a lot. Piccadilly Circus and the shops all lit up, and the crowd. I think it's stunning to stand there and watch the buses and taxis streaming along as though they'd never stop. And I like the Strand too. What are those lines about God and Charing Cross?" I was taken aback. "Thomson's, do you mean?" I asked. I quoted them. "And when so sad, thou canst not set a cry, and upon thy soul's sore loss shall shine the traffic of Jacob's ladder, pitched between heaven and Charing Cross." He gave a faint sigh. "I've read The Hound of Heaven. It's a bit of all right." "It's generally thought so," I murmured. "You don't meet anybody here who's read anything. They think it's swank." There was a wistful look on his face, and I thought I divined the feeling that made him come to me. It was a link with a world he regretted, in a life that he would know no more, because not so very long before I had been in the London which he loved. He looked upon me with awe and envy. He had not spoken for 5 minutes, perhaps, when he broke out with words that startled me by their intensity. "I'm fed up," he said. "I'm fed up." "Then why don't you clear out?" I asked. His face grew sullen. "My lungs are a bit dicky. I couldn't stand an English winter now." At that moment another man joined us on the veranda, and Lawson sank into a moody silence. "It's about time for a drain," said the newcomer. "Who'll have a drop of Scotch with me, Lawson?" Lawson seemed to arise from a distant world. He got up. "Let's go down to the bar," he said. When he left me I remained with a more kindly feeling towards him than I should have expected. He puzzled and interested me, and a few days later I met his wife. I knew they had been married for 5 or 6 years, and I was surprised to see that she was still extremely young. When he married her she could not have been more than 16. She was adorably pretty. She was no darker than a Spaniard, small and very beautifully made, and tiny hands and feet and a slight, lithe figure. Her features were lovely, but I think what struck me most was the delicacy of her appearance. The half-caste as a rule have a certain coarseness. They seem a little roughly formed, but she had an exquisite daintiness which took your breath away. There was something extremely civilized about her, so that it surprised you to see her in those surroundings, and you thought of those famous beauties who had set all the world talking at the court of the Emperor Napoleon III. Though she wore but a muslin frock and a straw hat, she wore them with an elegance that suggested the woman of fashion. She must have been ravishing when Lawson first saw her. He had but lately come out from England to manage the local branch of an English bank, and reaching Samoa at the beginning of the dry season, he had taken a room at the hotel. He quickly made the acquaintance of all and sundry. The life of the island is pleasant and easy. He enjoyed the long idle talks in the lounge of the hotel, and the gay evenings at the English club when a group of fellows would play pool. He liked Apia straggling along the edge of the lagoon, with its stores and bungalows, and its native village. Then there were weekends when he would ride over to the house of one planter or another and spend a couple of nights on the hills. He had never before known freedom or leisure, and he was intoxicated by the sunshine. When he rode through the bush his head reeled a little at the beauty that surrounded him. The country was indescribably fertile. In parts the forest was still virgin, a tangle of strange trees, luxuriant undergrowth and vine. It gave an impression that was mysterious and troubling. But the spot that entranced him was a pool a mile or two away from Apia, to which in the evenings he often went to bathe. There was a little river that bubbled over the rocks in a swift stream, and then, after forming the deep pool, ran on, shallow and crystalline, past a ford made by great stones, where the natives came sometimes to bathe or to wash their clothes. The coconut trees, with their frivolous elegance, grew thickly on the banks, all clad with trailing plants, and they were reflected in the green water. It was just such a scene as you might see in Devonshire among the hills, and yet with a difference, for it had a tropical richness, a passion, a scented languor which seemed to melt the heart. The water was fresh, but not cold, and it was delicious after the heat of the day. To bathe there refreshed not only the body but the soul. At the hour when Lawson went, there was not a soul, and he lingered for a long time, now floating idly in the water, now drying himself in the evening sun, enjoying the solitude and the friendly silence. He did not regret London then, nor the life that he had abandoned, for life as it was seemed complete and exquisite. It was here that he first saw Ethel. Occupied too late by letters which had to be finished for the monthly sailing of the boat next day, he rode down one evening to the pool when the light was almost failing. He tied up his horse and sauntered to the bank. A girl was sitting there. She glanced round as he came and noiselessly slid into the water. She vanished like a naiad startled by the approach of a mortal. He was surprised and amused. He wondered where she had hidden herself. He swam downstream and presently saw her sitting on a rock. She looked at him with uncurious eyes. He called out a greeting in Samoan, "Talofa." She answered him, suddenly smiling, and then let herself into the water again. She swam easily and her hair spread out behind her. He watched her cross the pool and climb out on the bank. Like all the natives, she bathed in a Mother Hubbard, and the water had made it cling to her slight body. She wrung out her hair, and as she stood there unconcerned, she looked more like ever like a wild creature of the water or the woods. He saw now that she was half caste. He swam towards her, and getting out, addressed her in English. "You're having a late swim." She shook back her hair, and then let it spread over her shoulders in luxuriant curls. "I like it when I'm alone," she said. "So do I." She laughed with the childlike frankness of the native. She slipped a dry Mother Hubbard over her head and letting down the wet one, stepped out of it. She wrung it out and was ready to go. She paused a moment irresolutely and then sauntered off. The night fell suddenly. Lawson went back to the hotel and describing her to the men who were in the lounge shaking dice for drinks, soon discovered who she was. Her father was a Norwegian called Brevald, who was often to be seen in the bar of the Hotel Metropole, drinking rum and water. He was a little old man, knotted and gnarled like an ancient tree, who had come out to the islands 40 years before as mate of a sailing vessel. He had been a blacksmith, a trader, a planter, and at one time fairly well to do, but ruined by the great hurricane of the 90s, he had now nothing to live on but a small plantation of coconut trees. He had had 4 native wives, and, as he told you with a cracked chuckle, more children than he could count. But some had died and some had gone out into the world, so that now the only one left at home was Ethel. "She's a peach," said Nelson, supercargo of the Moana. "I've given her the glad eye once or twice, but I guess there's nothing doing." "Oh, Brevald's not that sort of a fool, sonny," put in another, a man called Miller. "He wants a son-in-law who's prepared to give him in comfort for the rest of his life." It was distasteful to Lawson that they should speak of the girl in that fashion. He made a remark about the departing mail and so distracted their attention. But next evening he went again to the pool. Ethel was there, and the mystery of the sunset, the deep silence of the water, the lithe grace of the coconut trees, added to her beauty, giving it a profundity, a magic, which stirred the heart to unknown emotions. For some reason that time he had the whim not to speak to her. She took no notice of him. She did not even glance in his direction. She swam about the green pool. She dived. She rested on the bank, as though she were quite alone. He had a queer feeling that he was invisible. Scraps of poetry, half forgotten, floated across his memory, and vague recollections of the Greeks he had negligently studied in his school days. When she had changed her wet clothes for dry ones and sauntered away, he found a scarlet hibiscus where she had been. It was a flower that she had worn in her hair when she came to bathe, and having taken it out on getting into the water, had forgotten or not cared to put in again. He took it in his hands and looked at it with a singular emotion. He had an instinct to keep it, but his sentimentality irritated him, and he flung it away. It gave him quite a little pang to see it float down the stream. He wondered what strangeness it was in her nature that urged her to go down to this hidden pool when there was no likelihood that anyone should be there. The natives of the islands are devoted to the water. They bathe somewhere or other every day, once always, and often twice, but they bathe in bands, laughing and joyous, a whole family together, and you often saw a group of girls, dappled by the sun shining through the trees, with the half-castes among them, splashing about the shallows of the stream. It looked as though there were in this pool some secret which attracted Ethel against her will. Now the night had fallen, mysterious and silent, and he let himself down in the water softly, in order to make no sound, and swam lazily in the warm darkness. The water seemed fragrant still from her slender body. He rowed back to the town under the starry sky. He felt at peace with the world. Now he went every evening to the pool, and every evening he saw Ethel. Presently he overcame her timidity. She became playful and friendly. They sat together on the rocks above the pool, where the water ran fast, and lay side by side on the edge that overlooked it, watching the gathering dusk envelop it with mystery. It was inevitable that their meetings should become known. In the South Seas everyone seems to know everyone's business, and he was subjected to much rude chaff by the men at the hotel. He smiled and let them talk. It was not even worthwhile to deny their coarse suggestions. His feelings were absolutely pure. He loved Ethel as a poet might love the moon. He thought of her not as a woman, but as something not of this earth. She was the spirit of the pool. One day at the hotel, passing through the bar, he saw that old Brevald, as ever, in his shabby blue overalls, was standing there. Because he was Ethel's father, he had a desire to speak to him, so he went in, nodded, and ordering his own drink, casually turned and invited the old man to have one with him. They chatted for a few minutes of local affairs, and Lawson was uneasily conscious that the Norwegian was scrutinizing him with sly blue eyes. His manner was not agreeable. It was sycophantic, and yet behind the cringing air of an old man who had been worsted in his struggle with fate was a shadow of old truculence. Lawson remembered that he had once been captain of a schooner engaged in the slave trade, blackbirder they call it in the Pacific, and he had a large hernia in the chest which was the result of a wound received in a scrap with Solomon Islanders. The bell rang for luncheon. "Well, I must be off," said Lawson. "Why don't you come along to my place one time?" said Brevald in his wheezy voice. "It's not very grand, but you'll be welcome. You know, Ethel." "I'll come with pleasure." "Sunday afternoon's the best time." Brevald's bungalow, shabby and bedraggled, stood among the coconut trees of the plantation, a little away from the main road that ran up to Vailima. Immediately around it grew huge plantains. With their tattered leaves, they had the tragic beauty of a lovely woman in rags. Everything was slovenly and neglected. Little black pigs, thin and high-backed, rooted about, and chickens clucked noisily as they picked at the refuse scattered here and there. 3 or 4 natives were lounging about the veranda. When Lawson asked for Brevald, the old man's cracked voice called out to him, and he found him in the sitting-room smoking an old briar pipe. "Sit down and make yourself at home," he said. "Ethel's just titivating." She came in. She wore a blouse and skirt, and her hair was done in the European fashion. Although she had not the wild, timid grace of the girl who came down every evening to the pool, she seemed now more usual and consequently more approachable. She shook hands with Lawson. It was the first time he had touched her hand. "I hope you have a cup of tea with us," she said. He knew she had been at a mission school, and he was amused, and at the same time touched, by the company manners she was putting on for his benefit. Tea was already set out on the table, and in a minute old Brevald's 4th wife brought in the teapot. She was a handsome native, no longer very young, and she spoke but a few words of English. She smiled and smiled. Tea was rather a solemn meal, with a great deal of bread and butter and a variety of very sweet cakes, and the conversation was formal. Then a wrinkled old woman came in softly. "That's Ethel's granny," said old Brevald, noisily spitting on the floor. She sat on the edge of a chair, uncomfortably, so that you saw it was unusual for her, and she would have been more at ease on the ground, and remained silently staring at Lawson with fixed, shining eyes. In the kitchen behind the bungalow someone began to play the concertina, and 2 or 3 voices were raised in a hymn, but they sang for the pleasure of the sounds rather than from piety. When Lawson walked back to the hotel he was strangely happy. He was touched by the higgledy-piggledy way in which those people lived, and in the smiling good nature of Mrs. Brevald, in the little Norwegian fantastic career, and in the shining mysterious eyes of the old grandmother, he found something unusual and fascinating. It was a more natural life than any he had known. It was nearer to the friendly, fertile earth. Civilization repelled him at that moment, and by mere contact with these creatures of a more primitive nature he felt a greater freedom. He saw himself rid of the hotel which already was beginning to irk him, settled in a little bungalow of his own, trim and white, in front of the sea, so that he had before his eyes always the multicoloured variety of the lagoon. He loved the beautiful island. London and England meant nothing to him any more. He was content to spend the rest of his days in that forgotten spot, rich in the best of the world's goods, love and happiness. He made up his mind that whatever the obstacles, nothing should prevent him from marrying Ethel. But there were no obstacles. He was always welcome at the Brevald's house. The old man was ingratiating, and Mrs. Brevald smiled without ceasing. He had brief glimpses of natives who seemed somehow to belong to the establishment, and once he found a tall youth in a lava, his body tattooed, his hair white with lime, sitting with Brevald, and was told he was Mrs. Brevald's brother's son, but for the most part they kept out of his way. Ethel was delightful with him. The light in her eyes when she saw him filled him with ecstasy. She was charming and naive. He listened enraptured when she told him of the mission school at which she was educated, and of the sisters. She went with her to the cinema which was given once a fortnight, and danced with her at the dance which followed it. They came from all parts of the island for this, since gaieties a few in Upolu, and you saw there all the society of the place, the white ladies keeping a good deal to themselves, the half-caste very elegant in American clothes, the natives, strings of dark girls in white Mother Hubbards, and young men in unaccustomed ducks and white shoes. It was all very smart and gay. Ethel was pleased to show her friends the white admirer who did not leave her side, The rumour was soon spread that he meant to marry her, and her friends looked at her with envy. It was a great thing for a half-caste to get a white man to marry her. Even the less regular relation was better than nothing, but one could never tell what it would lead to, and Lawson's position as manager of the bank made him one of the catches of the island. If he had not been so absorbed in Ethel, he would have noticed that many eyes were fixed on him curiously, and he would have seen the glances of the white ladies and noticed how they put their heads together and gossiped. Afterwards, when the men who lived at the hotel were having a whisky before turning in, Nelson burst out with, "Say, they say Lawson's going to marry that girl." "He's a damned fool then," said Miller. Miller was a German-American who had changed his name from Müller, a big man, fat and bald-headed, with a round, clean-shaven face. He wore large gold-rimmed spectacles, which gave him a benign look, and his ducks were always clean and white. He was a heavy drinker, invariably ready to stay up all night with the boys, but he never got drunk. He was jolly and affable, but very shrewd. Nothing interfered with his business. He represented a firm in San Francisco, jobbers of the goods sold in the islands, calico, machinery and what not, and his good fellowship was part of his stock in trade. "You don't know what he's up against," said Nelson. "Someone ought to be him wise." "If you take my advice you won't interfere with what don't concern you," said Miller. "When a man's made up his mind to make a fool of himself, there's nothing like letting him. I'm all for having a good time with the girls out here, but when it comes to marrying them, this child ain't taking any, I tell you the world." Chaplin was there, and now he had his say. "I've seen a lot of fellows do it, and it's no good." "You ought to have a talk with him, Chaplin," said Nelson. "You know him better than anyone else does." "My advice to Chaplin is to leave it alone," said Miller. Even in those days Lawson was not popular, and really no one took enough interest in him to bother. Mrs. Chaplin talked it over with 2 or 3 of the white ladies, but they contented themselves with saying that it was a pity, and when he told her definitely that he was going to be married, it seemed too late to do anything. For a year Lawson was happy. He took a bungalow at the point of the bay round which Apia is built, on the borders of a native village. It nestled charmingly among the coconut trees and faced the passionate blue of the Pacific. Ethel was lovely as she went about the little house, lithe and graceful like some young animal of the woods, and she was gay. They laughed a great deal. They talked nonsense. Sometimes 1 or 2 of the men at the hotel would come over and spend the evening. And often on a Sunday they would go for a day to some planter who had married a native. Now and then one or other of the half-caste traders who had a store in Apia would give a party, and they went to it. The half-caste treated Lawson quite differently now. His marriage had made him one of themselves, and they called him Bertie. They put their arms through his and smacked him on the back. He liked to see Ethel at these gatherings. Her eyes shone, and she laughed. It did him good to see her radiant happiness. Sometimes Ethel's relations would come to the bungalow. Old Brevald, of course, and her mother, but cousins too, vague native women in Mother Hubbards, and men and boys in lava-lavas, with their hair dyed red and their bodies elaborately tattooed. He would find them sitting there when he got back from the bank. He laughed indulgently. "Don't let them eat us out of a hearth and home," he said. "They're my own family. I can't help doing something for them when they ask me." He knew that when a white man marries a native or a half-caste he must expect her relations to look upon him as a gold mine. He took Ethel's face in his hands and kissed her red lips. Perhaps he could not expect her to understand that the salary which had amply sufficed for a bachelor must be managed with some care when he had to support a wife in a house. Then Ethel was delivered of a son. It was when Lawson first held the child in his arms that a sudden pang shot through his heart. He had not expected it to be so dark. After all, he had but a 4th part of native blood. And there was no reason really why it should not look just like an English baby. But huddled together in his arms, sallow, his head covered already with black hair, with huge black eyes. He might have been a native child. Since his marriage he had been ignored by the white ladies of the colony. When he came across men in whose houses he had been accustomed to die as a bachelor, they were a little self-conscious with him, and they sought to cover their embarrassment by an exaggerated cordiality. "Mrs. Lawson well?" they would say. "You're a lucky fellow, damned pretty girl." But if they were with their wives and met him and Ethel, they would feel it awkward when their wives gave Ethel a patronizing nod. Lawson had laughed. "They're as dull as ditch water, the whole gang of them," he said. "It's not going to disturb my night's rest if they don't ask me to their dirty parties." But now it irked him a little. The little dark baby screwed up his face. That was his son. He thought of the half-caste children at Apia. They had an unhealthy look, sallow and pale, and they were odiously precocious. He had seen them on the boat going to school in New Zealand, and the school had to be chosen which took children with native blood in them. They were huddled together, brazen and yet timid, with traits which set them apart strangely from white people. They spoke the native language among themselves, and when they grew up the men accepted smaller salaries because of their native blood. Girls might marry a white man, but boys had no chance. They must marry a half-caste like themselves or a native. Lawson made up his mind passionately that he would take his son away from the humiliation of such a life. At whatever cost he must get back to Europe. And when he went in to see Ethel, frail and lovely in her bed, surrounded by native women, his determination was strengthened. If he took her away among his own people, she would belong more completely to him. He loved her so passionately. He wanted her to be one soul and one body with him. And he was conscious that here, with those deep roots attaching her to the native life, she would always keep something from him. He went to work quietly, urged by an obscure instinct of secrecy, and wrote to a cousin who was partner in a shipping firm in Aberdeen, saying that his health, on account of which, like so many more, he had come out to the islands, was so much better, there seemed no reason why he should not return to Europe. He asked him to use what influence he could to get him a job, no matter how poorly paid, on D-side, where the climate was particularly suitable to such as suffered from disease of the lungs. It takes 5 or 6 weeks for letters to get from Aberdeen to Samoa, and several had to be exchanged. He had plenty of time to prepare Ethel. She was as delighted as a child. He was amused to see how she boasted to her friends that she was going to England. It was a step up for her. She would be quite English there, and she was excited, and the interest the approaching departure gave her, when at length a cable came offering him a post in a bank in Kincardineshire, she was beside herself with joy. When the long journey over, they were settled in the little Scots town with its granite houses. Lawson realised how much it meant to him to live once more among his own people. He looked back on the 3 years he had spent in Apia as exile, and returned to the life that seemed the only normal one, with a sigh of relief. It was good to play golf once more, and to fish properly. There was poor fun in the Pacific when you just threw in your line and pulled out one big sluggish fish after another from the crowded sea. And it was good to see a paper every day with that day's news, and to meet men and women of your own sort, people you could talk to. And it was good to eat meat that was not frozen and to drink milk that was not canned. They were thrown upon their own resources much more than in the Pacific, and he was glad to have Ethel exclusively to himself. After 2 years of marriage, he loved her more devotedly than ever. He could hardly bear her out of his sight, and the need in him grew urgent for more intimate communion between them. But it was strange that after the first excitement of arrival, she seemed to take less interest in the new life than he had expected. She did not accustom herself to her surroundings. She was a little lethargic. As the fine autumn darkens into winter, she complains of the cold. She lay half the morning in bed, and the rest of the day on the sofa, reading novels sometimes, but more often doing nothing. She looked pinched. "Never mind, darling," he said. "You get used to it very soon, and wait till the summer comes. It can be almost as hot as in Apia." He felt better and stronger than he had done for years. The carelessness with which she managed the house had not mattered in Samoa, but here it was out of place. When anyone came, he did not want the place to look untidy, and laughing, chaffing Ethel a little, he set about putting things in order. Ethel watched him indolently. She spent long hours playing with her son. She talked to him in the baby language of her own country. To distract her, Lawson bestirred himself to make friends among the neighbours, and now and then they went to little parties where the ladies sang drawing-room ballades and the men beamed in silent good nature. Ethel was shy. She seemed to sit apart. Sometimes Lawson, seized with a sudden anxiety, would ask her if she was happy. "Yes, I'm quite happy," she answered, but her eyes were veiled by some thought he could not guess. She seemed to withdraw into herself so that he was conscious that he knew no more of her than when he had first seen her bathing in the pool. He had an uneasy feeling that she was concealing something from him, and because he adored her it tortured him. "You don't regret Apia, do you?" he asked her once. "Oh no, I think it's very nice here." An obscure misgiving drove him to make disparaging remarks about the island and the people there. She smiled and did not answer. Very rarely she received a bundle of letters from Samoa, and then she went about for a day or two with a set, pale face. "Nothing would induce me ever to go back there," he said once. "It's no place for a white man." But he grew conscious that sometimes, when he was away, Ethel cried. In Apia she had been talkative, chatting volubly about all the little details of the common life, the gossip of the place, but now she gradually became silent, and though he increased his efforts to amuse her, she remained listless. It seemed to him that her recollections of the old life were drawing her away from him, and he was madly jealous of the island and of the sea, of Brevald, and all the dark-skinned people whom he remembered now with horror. When she spoke of Samoa he was bitter and satirical. One evening late in the spring, when the birch trees were bursting into leaf, coming home from a round of golf, he found her not as usual lying on the sofa, but at the window, standing. She had evidently been waiting for his return. She addressed him the moment he came into the room. To his amazement she spoke in Samoan. "I can't stand it. I can't live here any more. I hate it. I hate it." "For God's sake speak in a civilized language," he said irritably. She went up to him and clasped her arms around his body awkwardly, with a gesture that had in it something barbaric. "Let's go away from here. Let's go back to Samoa. If you make me stay here, I shall die. I want to go home." Her passion broke suddenly and she burst into tears. His anger vanished and he drew her down on his knees. He explained to her that it was impossible for him to throw up his job, which after all meant his bread and butter. His place in Apia was long since filled. He had nothing to go back to there. He tried to put it to her reasonably, the inconveniences of life there, the humiliations which they must be exposed, and the bitterness it must cause their son. "Scotland's wonderful for education and that sort of thing. Schools are good and cheap, and he can go to the university at Aberdeen. I'll make a real Scot of him." They had called him Andrew. Lawson wanted him to become a doctor. He would marry a white woman. "I'm not ashamed of being half native," Ethel said sullenly. "Of course not, darling. There's nothing to be ashamed of." With her soft cheek against his, he felt incredibly weak. Section 7